Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Campion Hall here in Oxford. Welcome both to those of you here in person and all who are joining us online. It's my pleasure to welcome the Campion Lecturer of Hilary Term 2023, Dr. Daniel de Haan. Daniel is the Frederick Copleston Senior Research Fellow and Lecturer in Philosophy and Theology in the Catholic Tradition. This is a post named after the great Jesuit historian of philosophy, Frederick Copleston, who was a Fellow of Campion Hall. And it's a shared post with Blackfriars, so it's a pleasure to welcome Father John O'Connor, the Regent of Blackfriars Hall, and others from Blackfriars here this evening. Daniel's research covers a number of different areas, Avicenna and Aquinas, philosophy of religion. But one major strand of his research is on philosophical anthropology, bringing the insights of contemporary psychology, neuroscience, phenomenology, metaphysics into the understanding of what it means to be a human being. And that's the area within which today's lecture falls. Honour thy child, discerning the natural law, developmental virtues, and good enough parenting. And this is a good moment to mention that Daniel himself is a parent of 2 young children. So it's an interesting question how moral philosophy can begin to take better account of the developmental nature of human life. There'll be opportunity for questions after the talk, and those of you online are welcome to post your questions in the chat as well. So Daniel, thank you for sharing this part of your research with us, and we very much look forward to what you have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick, for this wonderful opportunity, and thank all of you for attending. Following the commandments concerning the worship of God, the Decalogue presents the precept to honor one's mother and father. It's perhaps surprising that there's no mention here of any precept for parents to honor their children. The precepts concerning idols, oaths, and the Sabbath quite naturally follow from the injunction to worship God above all else. But how are children to learn that they must honor their parents if their parents don't honor their children by teaching them the divine commandments of the Decalogue? Elsewhere, Scripture, of course, supplies the correlative familial precept, like St. Paul in Ephesians 6 and Colossians 3. But the basic question remains, are children, and the adults they become, exempt from the commandments or norms they were never taught? Can children discern how to be moral without their parents teaching them the rules of moral conduct? What resources are available to children, as well as to parents who once were children, for discerning good from bad, especially if they've been brought up in a family or in a cultural milieu that is morally impoverished or confused in some crucial ways? A very old Catholic tradition, drawing on both St. Paul as well as philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, argues children and adults do have such resources available to them. There is a law written upon our hearts, woven within our nature. God has created all human persons with the natural ability to discern the precepts of the natural law, to suss out the virtues and vices, and even to critically step back and evaluate any errors and misalignments in the moral norms we inherit from the cultural environment that has raised us. St. Thomas Aquinas is rightly regarded as one of the most significant contributors to the natural law tradition. And in this evening's lecture, my aim is to contribute to this Catholic tradition of philosophical and theological inquiry, albeit in a much smaller way, by redressing some significant omissions in our tradition. These lacunae bear upon how children and the adults they become are able to discern the natural law whether or not they've had good enough parents to teach it to them. What is often overlooked or even problematic in classical treatments of the natural law and in Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalism is the rather static understanding of the virtues and vices that contribute to human flourishing. The picture we have inherited tends to mistakenly identify human flourishing in this life, Aristotle's eudaimonia, or Aquinas' Natural Beatitudo, with a restricted age of human life, one that is intellectually mature and leisurely. In short, one which implicitly excludes from the conditions of human flourishing children, adolescents, and the parents preoccupied with raising them. As Alcester McIntyre has pointed out in his 1999 Dependent Rational Animals, Why Human Beings Need the Virtues, this omission isn't just characteristic of Aristotelian and natural law traditions of morality. Quote, in most moral philosophy, the starting point is one that already presupposes the existence of mature, independent, practical reasoners whose social relationships are the relationships of the adult world. The neglect of childhood parallels the neglect of both old age and of experiences at all stages of life of disability and of dependence. But practical reasoners enter the adult world with relationships, experiences, attitudes, and capacities that they bring with them from childhood and adolescence, and that always to some extent, some significant extent, and often to a very large degree, they're unable to discard and disown. My essential aim this evening is to articulate what a developmental approach to the natural law, virtues, and human flourishing discloses. I hope to show that this ontogenetic or developmental approach to the natural law not only sheds lights on our pair of familial precepts, but also delivers substantive answers to formidable objections to natural law and Neo-Aristotelian naturalism. But before I begin, I ought to fulfill my own obligations to honor those who've been so generous and kind to me. I want to acknowledge my gratitude to the Dominicans and the Jesuit fathers who have appointed me as the Frederick Cobblestone Senior Research Fellow, and to many others here at this hall and at Blackfriars who've become my colleagues and friends. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time at these halls, and it is a great blessing to be a member of these intellectual religious communities at Oxford. I look forward to our many future collaborative contributions to the Catholic tradition of intellectual inquiry. I also want to give due honor to my own parents, who will be celebrating their 40th anniversary, and are probably watching this right now, to my deceased grandparents who spent so much time raising me and my siblings, not raising, but taking care of us, and who were really very much a part of our lives. I'm also thankful to my wife, Victoria, and to her family, whose mother just spent a number of weeks with us, making it possible for me to do a lot of the research for this lecture, so I'm very grateful to you, Svetlana, and to our children, Dominic and Sophia. To all of you, I owe more than I could ever say. All right. When Father Nick kindly invited me to deliver the Campion lecture, I tried to select a topic that would allow me to gather some of my present incomplete inquiries concerning normative and scientific dimensions of philosophical anthropology, as well as address very practical and existential questions touching on all things human. In the first section of this lecture, I argue, even if we can naturally discern the familial pair of precepts, we nevertheless need familial virtues to apply these precepts to the ends to which these rules direct us, which is human flourishing. The virtue I propose to focus on is the virtue of good enough parenting. But much of what I say applies also to good enough grandparents and great-grandparents, to the good enough aunts or uncles, and to the good enough friends of parents with children. The raising of children pertains to our common goods, and parents inevitably look to others for advice, correction, compassion, and often help. And so I also must especially thank our family friend Leanna, who is watching our children our children tonight, so that I could provide my wife what is my interpretation of an evening without the kids. In the second section, I will introduce this virtue and examine what has gone wrong in 3 narratives about failures to be good enough parents, starting with Mr. Bennett from Pride and Prejudice. And in the third and final section, I show what light a developmental approach to the natural law can shed on our familial precepts and virtues, and how it also provides substantive responses to certain important neo-Kantian objections to the natural law and Neo-Aristotelian naturalism. We want to know why it is that natural philosophers and theologians like Aquinas take it that certain general moral precepts are known by all. First, we must notice that among the conflicts of modernity are conflicting meanings of morality. One widespread and problematic meaning restricts morality to universal and impersonal absolute obligations, which require or prohibit us from doing something. We should instead recognize, as Elizabeth Anscombe and John Haldane and others have argued, that every human action is morally significant. The sphere of morality is coextensive with the wide-ranging sphere of intentional and voluntary human actions which we perform and which contribute in some way or another to our goods and the goods and evils of others. But this does not mean all actions are of the same moral gravity, that all actions have the same obligatory force, that all goods are absolutely prescribed, or all bads are equally grievous. There's a plurality of goods to pursue and many ways to live good lives. What goods parents owe their children and what goods children owe to their parents will differ significantly, not only among contemporary families, but of course more so for families located in very different historical cultural times and places. The goods or bads of some rites of passage are non-existent in other cultures. Acknowledging this extraordinary diversity, nevertheless, does not undermine the possibility that some goods are such that without which human persons at any time or place could not possibly flourish, and some bad actions are such that performing them will always do irreparable damage to us or others, or will altogether undermine human flourishing, no matter the circumstances, time, or place. And among the latter are prohibitions against murder, torture, and adultery. Are all these theses easily discernible in the natural law? As articulate, justified, theoretical positions, they certainly are not. But there is more than one way for morality to be articulated, and its primary articulation is not in theoretical speech, but in everyday, practically reflective actions. And I shall return to how this can occur in everyday life, but it will perhaps be illuminating to first summarize Aquinas' theoretical articulation of the basic contours of the natural law. Human actions are governed by what Aquinas calls synderesis, the first principle of practical reason: seek good and avoid evil. Whether we are in the thick of performing an action, planning a future activity, or retrospectively reflecting on the successes or failures of past actions, in every case, the practical reasoning and willing that constitute our human actions are attracted to what we interpret as good and disinclined or repelled by what we judge to be bad. Aquinas claims that we can naturally deploy this formal principle, whether we realize it or not, in all of our human actions. This is where the first, second, and third kinds of precepts of the natural law come in. They are further embodiments and expressions of the more fundamental principles and rules of the natural law. The natural law, like all forms of law for Aquinas, realized four features. A law is an ordinance of reason directed to the common good that has been promulgated by one with due authority over the community. Aquinas distinguishes natural law, which is our rational nature's participation in the divine law, that is God, from positive laws that humans legislate, and as well from the divine law that's revealed in the Old and New Testaments. The first precepts of the natural law are given voice by Jesus Christ in his articulation of the two great commandments: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Variations on the latter include the Golden Rule, articulated in Matthew 7 as, "In everything, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, for this is the summation of the law and the prophets." These primary precepts Aquinas held are self-evident and intelligible to all. The second kind of precepts are intelligible to all, but they require some rational reflection to appreciate them. These precepts include those made explicit in the Decalogue and many more. And the third kind of precept are not at all obvious and often give rise to complex debates. Discerning the truth about these precepts often requires just recourse to moral theory. Consider now again our pair of familial precepts. Children, honor thy parents. Parents, honor thy children. According to Aquinas, the natural law precept corresponding to the fourth commandment can be known by everyone based on minimal consideration of the normative intelligibility of the concepts of a child, of parents, and of honor. Aquinas says children owe their parents honor because they provide them with their being, the support and care of their upbringing, and their instruction. How then should we understand the meaning of honor and its normative demands for children? There have been very different understandings of honor and associated virtues throughout human history. Aquinas, following St. Paul, has interpreted this precept to mean, at least, children should obey their parents. But obey how? In all things, no matter what? Certainly not. Aquinas takes note of one exception to the rule to obey one's father. If the father instructs his child in ways that are contrary to God, the child should not obey. This is because the precepts to love and worship and obey God are overriding precepts that we must follow if we are to correctly interpret and follow the subordinate precept to honor one's parents. In his commentary on Colossians 3, Aquinas writes, "The proper characteristic of children is obedience. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is pleasing to the Lord." Paul says in the Lord, because neither parents nor anyone else ought to be obeyed when they command something contrary to God. And further, it is because Aquinas holds both revelation and philosophical arguments can establish that God alone, as uncreated perfect goodness, can be the ultimate end of human action. God, the ultimate end, thereby supplies a principle for identifying all other true subordinate goods, ends, and means to our flourishing. What about our correlative familial precept? Parents, honor thy child. Should honor here also be interpreted as obedience, enjoining parents to obey their children's wishes or strongly felt desires? Aquinas thinks not. He interprets St. Paul's version of the precept, "Fathers, provoke not your children to anger," suggesting it is, quote, "It is not that fathers must give in to their children's will in all matters." Notice that the father manages his child for the child's advantage. It is necessary that fathers educate their children for the children's own good, not, however, by excessively restricting them or subjugating them. What this precept prescribes is for parents not only to be the source of their child's being, but to be committed to supporting and caring their children unconditionally, whatever might be their developmental needs. This precept is embodied in MacIntyre's suggested pledge for parents. "However things turn out, I will be there for you." To follow this precept therefore requires that parents make paramount the needs of the child and not their own needs in relationship to the child. The child's needs to drink, eat, be watched while sick, and comforted when distressed take priority over the parent's real needs for the same. Such needs also include instructing children such that they become educatable children, able to learn by themselves and from others, their teachers and their peers, how to identify their common and individual goods. About which Aquinas notes, parents must correct and educate their children that they might be of service to the Lord, that they should encourage them to do good and correct them to restrain them from evils. Even if we acknowledge the priority of the divine precepts, how should we coordinate these two precepts concerning children and parents? There will be times when following one rule will conflict with following the other. Here we should pause for a moment to notice how differently these two precepts have been interpreted, endorsed, rank-ordered, and employed even within the history of the West. It seems that many past moral cultures tended to overlooked the precept for parents to honor their children. Just look at the absence of the precept. While fathers were once presumed to be honorable, the contemporary recognition of documented failures of abusive parents and its pervasiveness has tainted fatherhood for many, leaving some feeling suspicious when they hear the command to honor fathers or obey parents. But if some earlier moral cultures tended to neglect what parents owe to their children, a shift to another extreme has sometimes emerged in the youth-driven culture of the past 60 years. Honor thy child, even obey thy child, seems to have become the implicit overriding norm in many cases today. How then are we to understand these precepts aright? By what normative standards can we critique the misinterpreted extremes of past and present moral cultures? How to distill true norms from misaligned rules or mere conventions posturing as norms? Here again, rule following on its own seems insufficient to address these questions. There are three major insufficiencies with mere rule-following accounts of morality, and each point to our need for the complementary normative guidance provided by the virtues. First, even exceptionalist prohibitions, like those against murder and adultery, only tell us what not to do. They don't supply practical reasoning with answers to what we should do in what are often very complicated, stressful situations. Second, we have already mentioned the importance of interpretation for rules like our pair of familial precepts. We need virtues, that is, transform dispositions, to intelligently respond to circumstances by identifying the relevant rules and transposing them into the particularities of one's own life. This is a daily task we regularly perform while cooperating with others through shared deliberation and execution. But we can only do this well if we recognize the way rule following contributes to flourishing, and that flourishing demands more than mere compliance with rules. This requires the insight that the point and purpose of rules is the ends that make the precept intelligible in the first place, which direct us towards human goods and direct us away from those bads which undermine our flourishing. Third, knowing the precepts and even how to apply them is insufficient to move us to follow the rules. This requires transforming our desires and attitudes such that we're willing to, at the very least, comply with the laws. There are 3 ways persons might merely comply with rules despite not desiring to do so. First, some persons only follow rules because they desire even more is avoiding the punishments that result from rule breaking. But should the risk of being punished at some time and moment seem worth taking, such persons will break the rules. Second are those persons who can be coaxed into following rules because of some extrinsic reward provided to those who follow the rules. Such persons don't desire to follow rules, but their desire for the rewards provides them with an overriding motivation to follow the rules. Third are those encratic persons who, though they do not find rule following particularly attractive or convenient, they nevertheless judge it right to follow rules and have enough self-control to do so. The transformations from being persons of the first kind to those of the second and third kinds are some of the critically important transformations parents and teachers engender in children. Like when they teach them various skills and routines concerning eating, hygiene, sleeping, safety concerning vehicles, strangers, and animals, as well as playing with others, especially games that require following rules, practicing musical instruments, and learning the basic elements of letters, words, and numbers. Such transformations are elementary steps towards the aspiration for practical wisdom and the moral virtues. These virtues transform and harmonize practical reasoning, perceptions, and desires so that we become, by second nature, disposed to find attractive only what goods the natural law directs us to and rightly demands of us. In the virtuous, there is no longer any felt desire or attitude conflicting with the good and true rules which enjoin or oblige us to do. One of Aquinas' important ethical insights is to recognize, then, the interdependency of rules and virtues for human flourishing. Notice that if we follow Aquinas and we define rules as essentially bound up with virtues and goods and human flourishing, then we will no longer be employing the same concept of rules used by those plain persons and theorists who conceive of rules independently from goods, virtues, and flourishing. Not only are the primary principles and precepts of the natural law elaborated and expressed in secondary precepts and often more parochial and variable rules, but they are similarly exhibited in virtuous activities. And this is why Aquinas contends that the natural law even commands the virtues. So one command is, be virtuous. It is the virtues that bring us from general and more specific rules to the normative particularities of actionable objects, ends, and circumstances. What virtue enables parents to follow and know how to apply the precept, honor thy child? It is the virtue of good enough parenting. We owe the evocative image of the good enough parent to the 20th century British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. In his famous BBC radio broadcasts, such as The Ordinary Devoted Mother and Her Baby, Winnicott sympathetically taught mothers and other caregivers that the aim of their parental devotion was to be good enough. Not only is the ideal of being a perfect parent unrealistic, it can be harmful to the child and the anxiety-stricken parent. The good enough mother aspires to do what is best for her child by drawing upon whatever resources she has available, but also recognizes that, like every mother, she will act imperfectly. Mothers shouldn't think they need to work hard at books to learn how to be perfect mothers from the beginning, Winnicott observes. Parents are bombarded by too much theory, so much that it unnecessarily generates a greater burden for parents who are then forced amongst their peers to pose as experts vying against other parents who are also posturing as experts. Recognizing that their proper aim is only to be good enough releases some of this unnecessary pressure. And by the way, I discovered that there's a technical term for this. It's called parent-splaining. But parent-splaining shouldn't be confused with the good enough family and friends who rightly provide, often unsolicited but courageously given, advice to parents who are making serious errors. Parents should be also good enough to listen to these sometimes unwelcome corrections. Winnicott, of course, does not identify parenting as a virtue, good enough parenting as a virtue, but his insights and normative characterizations of good enough parenting have all the hallmarks of an Aristotelian virtue. It is a cultivated disposition that has normative and an aspirational vector to do what is good for one's children. And what is that? Parents function well qua parents by enabling their children to function well qua developing human persons. That is, by providing what is required for their children to fulfill and even flourish with respect to their developing physiological, psychological, and social capacities, ends, needs, and reasonable wants. For parents to cultivate this virtue requires transforming themselves such that they learn from experience how to respond continuously to the physiological, psychological, and social needs and wants of their children, and to identify and direct them towards their developing ends. To aspire towards being a good enough parent also requires directing one's actions to hit upon the correct mean between extremes of excess and defect. The good enough mother, MacIntyre notes, has to steer a course between being overprotective of her child or affording her child insufficient security, as well as being overindulgent to her child or of being too severe. Here, as Winnicott recognized, good enough parenting was supported by later attachment theory of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. They identified a complementary Aristotelian media and the child who matures with a secure attachment to its parents, in contrast to those children who develop avoidant or resistant or even disorganized forms of insecure attachments to their parents or other caregivers. Infants, children, and adolescents shouldn't be given too much autonomy too early on. But they also must not be prevented from figuring things out for themselves, or restricting them from exploring their world, from the release that's then given by imaginative play, which in the future will enable them to imagine future possibilities of goods to pursue in their practices and in their relationships. And so too it is with responsibility and intimacy. The virtue of good enough parenting is the aspiration to find the right balance of care, concern, and comfort for each child at their stage of development and to help them to mature beyond it. This all sounds quite nice, but how do we identify the practical criteria that distinguish good enough parenting from norms of parenting that are not good enough? It will be instructive to consider what has gone wrong in cases of parents who fail to exhibit our virtue and precept. It is, of course, typically easy to identify examples of dreadful, horrible, psychologically and physically abusive parents, like Mr. Murdstone, the stepfather of David Copperfield. Their faults are many. The criteria for being a good enough parent will be tested better and set out in greater relief if we consider three kinds of parents who either we or they might be surprised to learn that they should be labeled as not good enough parents. I begin with Mr. Bennett. Most of Jane Austen's readers of Pride and Prejudice will recognize the putative failures of Mrs. Bennett. Many overlook, however, are the significant ways Mr. Bennett fails to be a good enough father. When contrasted with his frenetic wife or the insufferable Mr. Collins, we, the readers, are too amused by his sarcastic wit. And very much unlike Elizabeth, we enjoy his droll jokes at their expense. These charms distract us from Mr. Bennett's vices, or at least his acrosia, just as the absences of many attractive qualities of Mansfield Park's Fanny Price betray our inability to perceive her more attractive virtues. Mr. Bennett's first failure is simple. He's given up aspiring to be a good enough parent. Lionel Trilling draws our attention to this in his treatment of Austen on irony, which does not mean moral detachment or its frequent accompanying tone of superiority. This sort of irony Austen herself criticizes in the figure of Mr. Bennet, quote, whose irony of moral detachment is shown to be the cause of his becoming a moral nonentity. That's from Lionel Trilling. I don't think he's actually a moral nonentity. It's worse than that. From his first failure flows many others. He, of course, protects Elizabeth from Mr. Collins' proposal, but he seriously jeopardizes the prospects of Jane and Elizabeth by always retreating to the seclusion of his library, by his negligence or unwillingness to control his wife and daughters in key situations. The most striking example of this occurs when he fails to heed Elizabeth's courageously given advice for him to keep her sister Lydia from doing great harm to herself and her family by going off and traveling with a military family. With prescient concern for the common good of her family, Elizabeth insists that her concern is not due to, as her father jokingly suggests, resenting Lydia for scaring away potential lovers. Elizabeth makes quite clear to Mr. Bennet the following, quote, "It is not of peculiar, but of general evils which I am now complaining. Our importance, our respectability in the world, must be affected by the wild volatility, the assurance and disdain of all restraint which mark Lydia's character. Excuse me, for I must speak plainly. If you, my dear father, will not take the trouble of checking her exuberant spirits and of teaching her that her present pursuits are not to be the business of her life, she will soon be beyond the reach of amendment. Her character will be fixed, and she will, at 16, be the most determined flirt that ever made herself and her family ridiculous." It actually goes on quite a bit longer than this. Much later in the novel, after Elizabeth's worst fears come to pass with Lydia's elopement, which almost certainly at that stage in the novel seems to foreclose both Jane and Elizabeth's prospects with Bingley and Darcy, Mr. Bennet will come around to acknowledging his failures. He says, "Who should suffer but myself? It has been my own doing, and I ought to feel it. You may well warn me against such an evil. Human nature is too prone to fall to it. No, Lizzie, let me once in my life feel how much I have been to blame." Mr. Bennet's withdrawal from considering the goods of his whole family not only neglects what he owes to Lydia, he also thereby fails to anticipate the ways Lydia's behavior might harm also the individual goods of Jane and Elizabeth, for whom he cares a great deal about. Consider now two more contemporary cases. And I apologize, they will probably sound very American, but that's what I know. Imagine a well-off middle-class American family. The parents love each other, and they shower great affection upon their oldest son and his younger siblings. The parents encourage him to explore and cultivate his natural talents in music, sport, and school. And in all these areas he succeeds, and in many respects outstrips his peers. He is, throughout his youth and adolescence, generally liked, if not admired and praised, by many of his peers and their parents. He gets along remarkably well with his younger siblings and his parents, and he is also, in as many respects as one could expect from an adolescent, obedient to his parents. What has gone wrong is from time to time, and later with increasing occurrences, he is shielded from being accountable for his misbehavior. Shielded in quite extreme and stealthy ways by his parents. This starts with the nearly harmless acts of the naughtiness of young boys, like stealing pears and throwing them to swine. Imagine St. Augustine and friends are caught in the pears incident, but this time St. Monica comes in and not only persuades the authorities to let him off, but she goes out of her way to concoct an account to the authorities and her peers that Augustine was hardly involved and was even pressured into going along all the time, when in fact in this and other cases it was quite the otherwise. This pattern recurs with mother and father frequently getting involved in these ways of screening their son from being accountable and deflecting blame to others. As he grows up, these harmless acts escalate into occasional acts of vandalism of more serious kinds and situations wherein he and large groups of his peers are caught partaking of illegal substances, the consequences of which are being suspended from extracurricular activities like competing in music contests or athletic competitions, losing their driver's licenses and community service. Yet in all these cases, via special pleading with authorities and sometimes legal maneuvers, their son is exempted from these penalties while his peers are not. These parents have failed their son by misinterpreting the end to protect their child. They have cultivated a disposition to intervene and keep him from suffering the minor and major consequences of his bad actions. And this has deprived him of the need to acknowledge his mistakes and the promptings to transform his desires and practical reasoning so that he might be better disposed to, at the very least, follow rules, if not aspire for the goods these point towards. My third example focuses on two parents that fail to be good enough in quite a different way. Once again, we have two affectionate parents who support and encourage their daughter from an early age into adulthood to be successful. Both parents are themselves extraordinarily successful in their own careers. Despite having busy careers, they make time to be around their daughter and impress upon her the discipline and hard work required to be a high achiever like themselves. In school and in many extracurricular activities, she is indeed successful by these standards. But as she matures into adolescence and early adulthood, her parents fail to teach her and encourage her to identify standards and goods on her own. Instead, she is always seeking to please her successful parents in all things, and she pleases them by seeking their advice in all things and dutifully following it. Her textbook obedience to her parents and their undue eagerness to supply her with the successful way to do anything and everything nevertheless arrests her development. As her later university friends, boyfriends, spouse, and employers are astonished to discover, this young successful woman will frequently ring home to find out what mommy or daddy would do, which she then diligently executes. She has remained in important ways childish. In all she does, her primary motivation is often to please her parents, rather than pursue what is her own good. She is inadequately disposed to do what is good for her and her husband when it sometimes conflicts with what would please her mother or might even require what she misinterprets as disobeying her parents' advice. In each of these cases and many more could be given, it's important for us to recognize that these insufficiently good enough parents may well be good enough parents in other respects, or they were so at earlier or later stages in their children's lives. Few parents are well disposed to welcome all of the diverse needs and wants of their developing children. And furthermore, like all virtues, it is difficult to persist in being a good enough parent. In this respect, a virtue ethic is both more demanding and more humanely forgiving than moralities of mere obligatory rule following. What these observations reveal is the vital exigency for parents and children to regularly find time to retrospectively identify their past failures, to seek forgiveness, and hopefully transform what are stories of past failures and sins into stories of redressed errors, healed wounds, and redemptive grace. What's gone wrong in each of these cases is the parent's failure to identify the ends of their relationships to their children and to conform their motivations to the fulfillment of those ends. They did not grasp some of the crucial rule-defining ends of the pair of familial precepts, and they did not have, or they did not persist in the virtue of good enough parenting that would have enabled them to act according to these precepts by identifying their ends and the ends of their children. How do we identify the ends of our practices and relationships and distinguish these from our motivations? Before answering these questions, it will be helpful to distinguish and set aside two different approaches to the natural law tradition from the third that's adopted here. Since discerning how to identify such ends is essential to what I, following Robert Sokolowski and McIntyre, mean by discovering and discerning the natural law. It is time, therefore, for me to provide an account of what I mean by a developmental approach to the natural law. Classical natural law tends to suggest that we start with facts about human nature and rationally derive from them the moral norms that govern practical reasoning. Before we can practically reason about human goods, we first need to know certain facts about what is good for humans. By contrast, the so-called new natural law thinkers of the 20th century, like Germain Grousset and John Finnis, adopt a different approach. Persuaded by post-Enlightenment objections to naturalized normative theories, they concede that we cannot derive norms, oughts, or values of practical reason from facts about human nature. But these new natural law theorists contend we also don't need to. since internal to practical reason itself are self-evident, incommensurable basic goods, which govern all practical reasoning and moral precepts. I won't here engage in the indispensable task of engaging in debates with these rival natural law theories. Nevertheless, one challenge both approaches face is they haven't addressed the problem of how humans come to discern the natural law. They have not adequately appreciated the fact that human persons are by nature developing and dependent rational animals. Both theories seem to suggest humans discern the natural law starting life as adults. Discerning the natural law is instead, as I argue here, a developmental and socially dependent activity. It is not, however, a separate or independent activity from those reflective actions we already perform regularly. Discerning the natural law pervades our communal and individual activities of ordinary and extraordinary conversations, disagreements, and arguing over conflicting stories of what happened or should have been done. Within these activities, we often prune and critically sort through our massive inheritance or endoxa of moralities, of alternative tables of norms, of conventions, rules, virtues, and vices, and rival notions of happiness and flourishing. This is particularly true of the morality buffet that's on offer to us and our contemporaries, living as we do in the secular age, as Charles Taylor has defined it. We and our children have inherited a dizzying mishmash of conflicting moral social imaginaries. Discerning the natural law is therefore both more complex and simpler than either the alternative approaches to natural law have suggested. It's more complex because we discern the natural law in a socially scaffolded and developmental way. But discerning the natural law is also simpler than classical or new natural law theories would have it. And this is because the developmental approach identifies the discernment of the natural law with the aspiration for practical wisdom and the self-transformations afforded by it and the moral virtues. This aspiration commences with elementary reflective questions like, why is this good? Why must I do this rather than that? Why must I follow this rule? Or as my daughter will say on some occasions, I want to be a good girl, or I don't want to be a good girl, or why should I be a big girl? These are questions which expand as we grow in maturity. But such inquiring persons are tacitly aspiring towards practical wisdom insofar as the aim of their wonder concerns what are the true goods to be found among the norms and conventions I've received from my family, friends, teachers, and community. Learning how to ask these questions well needs to be complemented with the corresponding ability to find true answers from others and oneself. Answers that involve making distinctions, qualifications, and ranking in order diverse goods worthy of pursuit and setting aside bads to be avoided. A crucial distinction such ordinary practical inquirers will have to hit upon is that between the ends of some skill, routine, practice, or relationship and their motivations for engaging in these activities. Robert Sokolowski, Francis Slade, and McIntyre have shown in some detail the many ways ordinary persons cannot help but confront and discover in stories and in the telling of their own stories and in their own pursuits the contrast between ends and their motives or purposes in acting. To be successful in any well-defined skill or practice requires conforming one's motives to the ends of various activities, such as making risotto, playing Paul McCartney's Blackbird on guitar, or performing open-heart surgery. We might have many motives that go beyond the internal ends of a specific practice, but if these motives crowd out or undermine the motives required for achieving the ends of a practice or skill, they will compromise the very practice itself. That is, they will prevent us from enjoying the goods found in fulfilling those ends. Our lives are replete with such ends and motives. As children develop, they're taught rules and standards by which they can evaluate their performances in diverse activities. These start with elementary skills and routines, holding and then drinking from a bottle and later from a cup, eating with a spoon and fork, putting on clothes, and potty training. Later, they're introduced to practices and their complementary skills, such as learning to play chess, piano, kicking a football, and eventually playing football matches. Children might need external rewards to motivate them to learn any of these practices at first. But in each case, children, and later the adults they become, can only achieve the internal goods of these activities by aligning their motives and so too transforming their practical reasons, perceptions, and desires to conform with the ends of the relevant skill, routine, or practice. Identifying the ends of skills and practices is often straightforward enough. What is more challenging is to identify the dynamic, complex, developing, and more ambiguous ends of our various relationships. Relationships are of many kinds: acquaintances, neighbors, co-workers, religious brothers and sisters, friends, spouse, siblings, and of course, parents and children. As we mature, we are initiated into the norms, rules, and conventions of the already existing culturally complex nexus of these relationships. Children learn these conventions and norms from stories, from reflecting on their experiences, observing and imitating exemplars, and receiving advice from family, friends, and teachers. As with cooperative practices, relationships tend to succeed when their participants conform their motives to the putative ends of their shared relationship. Relationships deteriorate when one or more participants pursue motives that conflict with the ends of their relationship. Purported friends that are freeloaders, frequently lie to, manipulate, betray, or spread malicious gossip about their so-called friends will likely not be regarded as friends for very long. And learning how to make these distinctions between ends and motives, children will also need to identify within their motives the differences between their wants and their needs. Parents and teachers, of course, will often help them make these distinctions by initiating them into the conversational activities of reason giving, of stepping back and asking questions concerning what they need or want, why they desire to satisfy this want or need here and now, or in that way rather than this way. Ends supply us with reasons for acting, while wants, on their own, do not. The identification of the goods to be achieved by conforming one's motives to the true ends of practices and relationships will supply children, adolescents, and adults not only with reasons for acting, but with good reasons for acting. This is a difficult distinction to observe. As McIntyre points out, quote, "The child will have to learn through its experiences of attachment and affection that in order to satisfy its desires, it must please its mother and other adult figures. It therefore acts so as to please those adults. Yet what those adults have to teach the child, if the child is indeed to become an independent practical reasoner, is to identify what is good and best to do, which might not always be what pleases their parents and other adults. All adults find it difficult, and some find it impossible to teach this to children." Life is, of course, much more complicated than merely discerning the ends and one's motives within one practice, isolated from others, or within a single relationship standing on its own, for practices and relationships do not stand on their own. For a unified and well-directed life requires rank ordering diverse goods, navigating and harmonizing the motives and ends of the diverse practices and relationships we engage in. The pressure to compartmentalize will only lead us to a disintegrated form of life, one with persisting conflicting motives and ends, with irreconcilable practices and relationships. How can we avoid becoming unstable, self-divided selves? First, we cannot do it without a modicum of self-knowledge, one informed by truthful friends and family members, sometimes telling us painful truths. They are among the major participants in our stories, as we are in their stories. What is needed, too, is the leisurely rest to engage in such reflective examinations alone and with others. We do this often enough in the conversational activities of sharing stories about what we have done, and in seeking advice and evaluating how my life is going and where it is headed. Asking what place should these relationships and practices have in my life? What must I change about my habits, dispositions, desires, attitudes, practical reasoning, and motives in order to ensure that I can harmonize and achieve these ends and not compromise them? It's also in these leisurely or stressful reflections that we must acknowledge and evaluate the common goods needed to be achieved in order for our family, friends, and colleagues to pursue and not be unjustly impeded from them pursuing their complementary individual goods. This is what I said was more or less the failure of Mr. Bennett. It bears emphasizing that good enough parents will only succeed insofar as they are also aspiring to be good enough spouses, good enough friends, good enough co-workers, not to mention good enough children to their own parents. Second, the transformations of practical reasoning, ways of perceiving our interactions with others, and our desires and willingness to conform our motives to our ends will require that we aspire to acquire and cultivate certain virtues. Many of these virtues will be virtues that are specific to flourishing one specific kind of relationship or one specific kind of practice, like good enough parenting. But there will also be transformations that are required for us to succeed in every relationship and in every practice, virtues that enable us to coordinate and harmonize diverse goods of our diverse practices and different relationships. These will include, at the very least, the cardinal virtues. Elizabeth Bennet needed prudence to identify and apply relevant rules to her particular situation, justice to seek to redress the potential harms to the common goods of her family, courage to confront her father, and temperance to moderate her words at first, and then to perceive the need to be more insistent when the point didn't come across. Third, we can only coordinate and rightly direct our virtues and the subordinate goods that constitute human flourishing by discovering and aligning them with our ultimate end, which is knowing and loving God. Crucial here is the philosophical and theological conclusion that our ultimate end cannot be identified with any real goods in this life, since all of them are incomplete and insufficient in themselves. A conclusion that aligns with the first three commandments of the Decalogue. To justify these contentious theses would require filling out in more rigorous detail than I can here Aristotle's Aragon argument concerning the function of developing independent rational animals and their ultimate end, an argument that has been supplemented, enriched, and defended in multi-stage reiterations given by Aquinas, Sokolowski, McIntyre, and many others. What I have said so far is but a rehearsal of these other participants' argumentative contributions to Aristotelian and natural law traditions. Let me conclude with my own imperfect, but I hope good enough contribution to this tradition. In the final section. A defining aspect of the natural law theory is that human nature is normative. Unlike neo-Kantians, who locate the source of normativity in the constitution of pure practical reason, natural law contends our very nature, as rational animals, is the source of our actionable norms. A serious challenge to this version of natural normativity comes from neo-Kantians who object. The ethical norms provided by neo-Aristotelian naturalists are always rooted in the constitution of practical reason, independently of human nature. Take any rule, norm, or virtue, and it's always practical reason that's the source. Nature, for these Aristotelians, only ever provides the material constraints for how these norms are applied. Nature, therefore, fails to be a source of normative criteria for Aristotelians, contrary to what they claim. One of the main ways Aristotelians actually problematically play into this challenge is by exclusively identifying the function of our nature and human flourishing with the activities of the rational soul performed well in accordance with virtue. A normative definition of human flourishing, which is indistinguishable from the pure practical rational agent of neo-Kantians. We need to enrich our normative anthropology of flourishing by coming to grips with the entire developmental span of human life. We need to identify the developmentally distinctive features of flourishing, to speak too broadly, that are indexed to zygotes, fetuses, neonates, infants, toddlers, school children, adolescents, young adults, adults with younger or older children, adults with empty nests, adults with no children, of grandparent adults, of retiring adults, of the elderly, and of the senescent. The distinctive features of developing independent rational animals will be comprised of diverse, integrated, or disintegrated physiological, psychological, personal, and social factors, which all develop at different rates in different persons, resulting in different children and adults having different capacities, needs, and wants at the different stages of their lives. The norms for flourishing at each phase will be made intelligible by appreciating and synthesizing two features: First, what are the characteristic normative markers of flourishing for each phase of human development? What they are for adolescents will obviously be different from what they are for the elderly. Second, we can only identify the characteristic flourishing of each phase if we understand them as maturing from prior phases and maturing towards subsequent phases of development. We can now conclude then with a brief response to the Neo-Kantian challenge by showing what the developmental approach to the natural law teaches discerning parents and children about the ends of the familial pair of precepts. We've seen why rules are never actionable, and so we need the virtues. But the virtues and rules need to be homed in on the forms of flourishing appropriate to the developing person's phase of life, and not some abstract consideration of the mature, leisurely, contemplative Aristotelian flourishing philosopher. We can only discern what the actionable norms are in any relationship and circumstance by incorporating indispensable normative facts or thick descriptions pertaining to this human person's developing physiological, psychological, social capacities, needs, and wants. The precepts, honor thy child and honor thy parents, therefore will necessarily have different inflected ends given the different developmental stages of parents and children. Consider the distinct demands these precepts make within 4 very crudely distinguished phases of life when it comes to how the overall directionality of one's life is set. At a first stage, young children are entirely dependent upon their parents to set the directionality of their lives. They honor their parents by obeying their instructions, by learning from them what rules, virtues, and flourishing demand of them. At a second stage, encompassing adolescence, parents honor their children by teaching them how to set the directionality of their own lives, but they still remain too immature to exercise the accountability required for being an independent and mature, developing independent rational animal. They honor their parents by learning from them how to identify the ends and their motives within good relationships and practices, and they also learn, or they should learn, that they should only aim to obey and please their parents and others insofar as it is good to do so. At a third and extended stage of adult life, children will have become largely independent of their parents by becoming entirely accountable, or nearly entirely accountable, for setting the directionality of their lives. Children, however, can still continue to honor their parents by sharing their lives together, by now making collaborative contributions to the directionality of each other's lives. Parents honor their children by accepting this and by coming now to contribute in new ways to the directionality of their children's lives and perhaps their children's lives. In many lives, children often enter a fourth stage, wherein they recognize they will need to begin setting more and more the directionality of their parents' lives. They honor their parents and exhibit the virtues of acknowledged dependence by providing for their parents what their parents had once provided for them. In each of these developing ways, good enough parents and children will be discerning the natural law. They will be doing it by aspiring to live up to the commands to honor thy parents and honor thy children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very wonderful way you combine some serious theoretical issues in moral philosophy with a sort of richness of narrative experience, and the two have integrated wonderfully, so thank you for that. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. I'll begin with a short question. 2 of the narratives you gave, in your title you have this word discerning, and it seems to me that what you're saying, a lot of moral insight concerns discerning the real good from the apparent good, and 2 of your narratives bear that out. One of them is the very successful middle class talented person who's protected by his parents, which is a good, but protected in the wrong kind of a way, which leads to a kind of lack of accountability in his life. And the second is the example of the daughter who's obedient, which is a virtue, but obedient in the wrong kind of a way. In both of those cases, that discernment happens over a period of time, doesn't it? It's the sort of distorted development of those two characters, one towards accountability and one towards this childish obedience. So I suppose my question is, to what degree does the discernment of the natural law depend upon that contrast experience, not so much necessarily always understanding what human flourishing is, but understanding over time through a kind of spiral downwards that that's not the path to go, this kind of negative contrast experience of human flourishing?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and a very nice summary of those two cases of what I was getting at. Yeah, I think largely, given limited resources and even impoverished resources, it's more likely to occur in those contexts, and it's likely to come out into conflicts in which those individuals are with others who have some particular insight into that's what's been going on in a long time. But the important part of telling their story so that they get into these contexts in which they've told stories where others can perhaps perceptively see there's something that's been going on repeatedly over and over that's leading to these problems. Of course, I mean, part of the other claim here is that the reading of many different stories in a kind of critical way with friends and families, of asking critical questions about stories and narratives, supplies one with a variety of ways, like a kind of armament of ways of noticing these kinds of distinctions. But I think much more the case is as you've described, that it occurs over a long period of time, retrospectively looking backwards.
Yeah, and with the help of somebody sort of reflecting back.
Yeah. And often because of some conflict those others might be causing with respect to your own relationship as well.
Okay. Good, thank you. So would anyone like to ask a question? Yin will come round with the microphone.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm very interested by the attempt to kind of take up Winnicott's positive valuation of moral entropy. And thinking of another contrast experience, to what extent does being a good enough parent depend upon having and becoming a bad enough child? In that the bad enough child gives you the kind of the situation in which you need to develop the virtue, but also becoming a child who will define yourself relative to your parents in a way which is potentially disobedient is also necessary to being a good enough parent. Now, obviously, I have no parenting experience, so I'm seeking exculpation in my own bad enough childhood.
I especially chose the topic of good enough parents because I knew my audience would primarily be graduate students and religious. So you can't second guess some of the things I say as much. Yeah, so here's one point I think that's important that I didn't have time to get into is one way parents become good enough that are not in the scenario that you described are when parents who have children with severe disabilities, which require unconditional commitments, which often require them having to change radically the directionality that they had so far been planning for their lives. And those kinds of heroic forms of good enough parents don't require having bad children. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, I think you're right that it really does sort of test the mettle of parents to show what kind of parent they are when they have a children who's becoming bad enough and how they can they can respond to those situations. But I mean, in some cases, even with good enough parents, they still can't do anything, nevertheless, about the bad child. So I take your point that I think that you're right. There are plenty of circumstances in where that's really what comes out. It's not hard, or it's not as difficult to be a good enough parent, to really be tested and really have to cultivate those virtues, to become much more imaginative and creative about being a good enough parent when one's children are not bad enough that it requires that it pulls them out of them.
Professor Cottingham.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for fascinating and beautifully lucid, if I may say so, talk. It struck me that the general framework was a very intellectualist one, about rational discernment of the good and the conditions for human flourishing, albeit one that needed to be developed over time. But I was thinking of Aristotle's comment that habits of feeling are just as crucial as habits of discernment and action. And interestingly, the word honor seems to carry more than simply prescriptions about conduct. The Romans talked of pietas and the Greeks of eusebeia, both of which imply, I think, quite strong emotions as well as actions. And of course, the family, unlike many other arenas for the exercise of virtue, is a locus of very powerful emotions. So it's really just a suggestion for an area that possibly is not covered by the idea of rational discernment.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. As you'll notice, I like long lists of things, and normally emotions would have been there, but it got elided or taken over within desires, but it still would have been strongly intellectualist in the ways that you suggested. And I think obviously much more needs to be said about the challenges of children having strong emotions and parents having strong emotions. And some of what I was saying about pleasing, whether one's doing something because it pleases the parents, and children who feel a strong sense that there's something emotionally wrong with them if they're not, like, pleasing their parents. And so I think you're right, and I think that I would probably fail to develop those areas without someone like you drawing attention to it. But there was at least some excuse of the omission, is that my lists were too long already, and emotions got put under desires. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
It was a brilliant talk, Daniel. Thank you. And I'm going to complain about something else, which is the good enough terminology. Not that I think you're onto something very important about the imperfection of parenthood, but if you think about the origin of the phrase, it's against a notion of I could be a perfect parent, which is, as you put it, paralyzing. But most of the time, parents need to be encouraged to be better parents. And I'm afraid that this is, as a vocabulary, while charming, is in a way misleading, because there's a struggle that you need to do. And the idea of, well, I'm good enough is really never an acceptable answer in your own moral life. So I'm sort of complaining about that vocabulary.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It can ring both ways. Part of it was to draw attention to this large body of Winnicott's and then subsequent research that is not meaning it in that sense, and is meaning it, and that's why I was making it very much a virtue. And so, yeah, it's a good point about how that word is going to kind of ring off to others. But the point of making it a virtue is to give it this aspirational vector that it really does mean, and obviously as a virtue, it's quite challenging. It is something that's very demanding for them. So, yeah, I'll have to give further thought to that. But thank you.
Thank you so much for a great lecture. Similar to Edward, I'm wondering, is God, in your view, a good enough father? If he's not, if he's better than that, aren't we supposed to be like God?
Yeah, so better than good enough. Part of, I think, the context of this is one thing is a recognition of when you have the virtues, it's very rare people are actually virtuous. That really virtue formation is more about the aspiration for virtue cultivation. And so one of the things I also take it that Winnicott has in mind by saying good enough is a lot of going around about how to be the perfect parent. And so there's already a distortion of the concept of perfection. And so because you're living in a milieu where in which the very concept of what it is to be a perfect parent has already been eroded, such that good enough now becomes hitting upon the ideal. So terminology is always going to corrode. We're always going to corrupt evocative, helpful images in different kinds of ways. And so, I mean, perhaps good enough has already been too corrupted and corroded, and so we're going to have to say, just try to be a parent or something like that. But Anyway, without being too cheeky, that's kind of, I think, what my response to that is that the idea of being a perfect parent had already been corrupted of what perfection meant in this kind of posturing as an expert of having read all of these things and implementing now this specialized theory, whatever it might be, that he's trying to say that's not what's actually necessary for you to do well at this.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk. This is my first time looking into these fields, and I find it really fascinating. And I must apologize in advance if my comment or question is going to sound very naive or uninformed, but it seems like the discussion is leading to my question anyway, if I'm hoping at least. So you started off by saying about the concept of good enough, which somewhat gave me as a parent like a feeling of like, oh, okay, I don't really need to be perfect. But as you went on throughout the talk, I sort of realized that, oh, this concept is actually not really easy to implement as parent. Like you say, it is a virtue. And I wonder, then I started thinking that maybe then people will start aiming to be the perfect, good enough parent because we're sort of like just that we can't overshoot and do too much, but we also cannot do too little. We sort of have to aim in the middle, and there's that perfect spot in the middle where you become the good enough parent. It's just like some thoughts in my mind.
Yeah, so part of the thing to even rescue the idea of a good enough parent is by making it into a virtue. And by making it into a virtue is to show why it's demanding, but why it's also forgiving. And as you just described, Aristotelian virtues have a mean. They're a mean between types of excess and defect, of not doing enough or of going overboard or setting the ideals too far. So in some ways, the idea of making an Aristotelian virtue is meant to capture the demandingness, the forgivingness, and also that it's got a vector that's in the middle between these extremes. It's one that has to be socially and culturally, it's with good friends that you discuss these things and try to like challenge yourself and determine when you've made mistakes, and you're going to be imperfect in that. That's why virtues are also these sort of aspirational vectors. So it is all those things, but it is also by making a virtue, as I said, trying to sort of redirect good enough away from the ways that it might be misunderstood.
Yeah, I wonder if, quite key in your account of how we grow in moral knowledge seems to be the ability to receive what Aquinas called fraternal correction, or that sort of correction from another. Jane Austen, famously Mr. Knightley with Emma, is a good example of that, as well as you pointed out, Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet. And there is a sort of cultural difficulty with that for us. If the emphasis is always on success and perfection and so on, to actually acknowledge one's failings is seen as a no-go area. It's too catastrophic to do that. And so I think one of the helpful things about that phrase, good enough parenting, is it is a forgiving phrase, as you say, that it's actually therefore okay for me to admit my limitations with a kind of humility and acknowledgement of where I've gone wrong. Not in an air of resignation, but so that I can learn that and then move on from that. So I think that there's something quite Christian, in fact, in your account here of the importance of humility as a admission of sin or failing, contrition, repentance, that kind of thing. So for that reason, I think that's one of the helpful things about that phrase, which is sort of capacious enough to allow for that, okay, I've got it wrong, how can I learn from this? Good. We do have a question online, but again, it's around good enough parenting, so it's a good question, but I'll if you'll forgive me, I'll leave that aside because we have address that question of good enough parenting from another number of different angles. But I want to end by thanking everyone who's attended this talk here and online. And thank you especially, Daniel, for, as has been said, a very lucid, very engaging, very rich talk, which has got us all reflecting, whether we're parents or not, on what it means to live a good life. So thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew.